Hello, friends. I'm going to talk about one record today. Somebody told me they were watching this thing and said I would talk about too many records in each episode. So I'm going to talk about one this time, but it's a really good one. It's a record you may not have heard of because I tell people about this recording artist and sometimes they say, "Who?" Like they don't know, and everyone should know. Unfortunately, he had some troubles in his career involving being compared to a much larger musical entity. But then again, around that time, a lot of people were being compared to the Beatles because the Beatles were hugely influential. Of course, when the Beatles show up and start recording, the early days of the Beatles, everybody suddenly had mop tops and were playing Beatles-y songs. And every TV sitcom, the kid on the show would start a band, right? So everybody was band crazy. But then as they progressed, they started experimenting more. And then the idea about the Beatles became this sort of experimental thing. They went through the psychedelic phase. And then people started really concentrating on the idea of the songwriting and the production. People started, talking about record producers. People talked about George Martin and the recording process. And a lot of bands started, instead of just going in and saying, okay, plug your guitar here, plug your bass there, sit the drums over there, let's record the standard issue pop songs, they started spending a bit more time and effort and bringing in other musicians and trying new things. That was sort of what the Beatles gave us a bit. In some ways, Brian Wilson did a lot of that as well, and a few others. I won't get into it. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about who invented pop music, but a lot of people agree that it was like the Beatles and the Beach Boys who kind of gave us both sides of the lake, this type of British pop and then super Americana pop, Beach Boys singing about, surfing USA and all that. And the combination of those two things kind of opened up this world of pop music that not anyone, but all these great songwriters suddenly were able to justify the idea of writing songs that didn't sound like every other pop song. They would use different kinds of instrumentation. They would spend more time on the chord progressions and the melodies and the tones and the things like that, the sounds that you would hear. It wasn't just, the rock and roll that you would hear. It was a new kind of thing. And there were bands in California that were doing this sort of sunshine pop like the Beatles and a few, I'll stop right there because there's a zillion bands that represent the sort of California pop scene of the 60s and early 70s. But one guy he had a band that was sort of popular called the Merry-Go-Round. You know who I'm talking about now? Really great sort of sunshine pop, almost like a bubblegum pop band. Great songs. I think they only did one album, but there's other albums of collected material, like they do. But this guy went on and recorded some solo albums. He recorded music constantly. He was kind of like one of the originators of the home recording thing, where you hear people that are like the godfather of home recording, or the person who recorded all their stuff. Like, I've talked about R. Stevie Moore and Todd Rundgren and people like that who are kind of known for not just writing songs and singing and being a pop star, but also being a producer and defining the sound of the music and the construction of the music. Emitt Rhodes is this guy's name. Just a really great songwriter. And he had an album that came out, or that was actually recorded in the late 60s, but wasn't really, I think it was considered like a contractual obligation type of album, and it was called The American Dream. But the first proper Emitt Rhodes album, a lot of people consider this one to be the premiere, the debut, because it seems to be more of a product of Emitt Rhodes, and it is, the album is called Emitt Rhodes, and I have it on CD. I also have it on vinyl somewhere, but I only have the CD with me right now. But so it's really tiny, but I will make it larger. There it is. There's Emitt looking through the window. See him? He's in there. And there's his name right there. And there he is in that abandoned building. I hope he sees that guitar over there. It's a really nice guitar. Looks like somebody left it in that abandoned house. Hopefully he'll go get it. But anyway, this album is so good. I'm telling you, it is if you like pop music, if you like the sort of pop that comes from these beautiful chord changes, these lovely riffs, this album is basically piano based. I think he was a piano player first and foremost, but he also played bass and guitar. He played everything on this album: guitars, drums, bass, and he did all the singing on it. And there are incredible background vocals on here. Beautiful vocal melodies, fun lyrics, great lyrics, definitely of their time. But Emitt Rhodes just had a sound. You hear it and it's like, that's Emitt Rhodes' voice. And unfortunately, when this album came out, he was being, I think, unfairly compared to Paul McCartney, because you always think Paul McCartney playing the piano, playing the bass, and doing on his solo albums and his post Beatles things. You always get the impression that Paul was this multi-instrumentalist and he could play anything and do anything, and that he, created his own lush pop landscape. And that's what this is. This album is a lush pop landscape of really beautiful songs, really fun, poppy, upbeat, kind of cute songs. They're not. There's nothing dark on here. Maybe there is if you really analyze, but it's just a happy, sunshiny California sounding record. And there is, and unfortunately, he was compared to Paul McCartney so much that I think it probably hurt him ultimately to be that compared. I mean, people were saying he's copying. People were saying that they thought, when they heard this, they thought it was a new Beatles album. And I listened to it and I'm like, how would you be that tone deaf? I mean, it doesn't sound like the Beatles to me. It's pop. It has guitar, drums, bass, piano, and singing and beautiful background vocals. There are moments on here where you can sense the inspiration of the Beatles and the individual Beatles. There's some bass playing on here. There's a song called Long Time No See that has some of that Paul McCartney-esque, the doo-doo-doo, doo-doo-doo, that kind of his Hofner bass sound, which is kind of almost an acoustic-y, not a whole lot of sustained sound with the bass. Not a lot of treble, not a lot of high end, but it has that doo-doo-doo. You've heard it on the Beatles albums. He does that in here a little bit, but that to me is inspiration. He was inspired by Paul McCartney's sound. He's not like, I don't think he's actively ripping him off in a way that he thinks that people are going to listen to this and think, it's the Beatles. I mean, why would somebody do that? It's like, he's doing his own thing. He just happens to have really been in writing music in a time when the Beatles were ubiquitous. How can you avoid not being inspired by the Beatles? Other than that, he's definitely got his own sound and his own vibe, his own feel, and his own songwriting style too. It is verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus, fade. It's that format of pop song. There's great hooks. I mean, great hooks and beautiful vocal melodies that he does these, vocal background vocals that counterpoint the vocal melody in such a great way. But, in retrospect, I wonder if at the time when this record came out, there just wasn't a whole lot going on that was done by the sort of singer-songwriter recording by himself at home, predominantly playing a piano and writing these lovely poppy melodies. So people listened to it, and the first thing they thought of was the Beatles, because the Beatles were everywhere. And I think if this record had come out maybe a little bit earlier or a little bit later, or if Emitt Rhodes had been recording in a little bit later time when there was more pop bands and just in general a lot of diversity in pop, people might not have made that association. But unfortunately, he did it around the time when Paul McCartney was. So when all these records were coming out, people were saying, he sounds like him, And I think that's unfortunate. He seems to have let that, I don't know, I'm not going to speak for him. Sadly, he passed away a few years ago. And I wonder if he got the acclaim that he deserved. I wonder if he felt it. There were a lot of people who I know, musicians, really appreciate him. A lot of people I know, music fans, folks who get into obscure pop. Unfortunately, this record is kind of obscure. I mean, I think more people now know about it than they did, like, say, in the 80s or something. It's a classic album, and there's others, but I'm only going to talk about this one in this episode. I think if you like pop music, you like beautifully written songs, you like great instrumentation, you like to hear something that comes from one mind, like he did everything on this album. So the art quality of it is undiffused. It's not diffused among different creative forces coming in and telling him what to do, because he recorded it at home. He had a home recording studio. I think he made a little money with that band, the Merry-Go-Round, and was able to buy some gear, mixer, and evidently he recorded it on a 4-track recorder, probably a TIAC 4-track reel-to-reel, where you got 4 tracks. You really have to figure out in those days what you're going to put on each one of these tracks. And if you want something to be stereo, you eat up 2 whole tracks, and then you have 2 more tracks. What are you going to do? You got to put your drums and your bass on there, and then your stereo guitar, or a guitar, lead guitar, rhythm guitar, piano, drums, and bass. And it's like, okay, that you've used up all 4 of your tracks, and then you're like, oh no, now how am I going to sing? So what he did was, I think he took that 4 track somehow and went to some people in the business that he knew from his Merry-Go-Round days, I think. I'm not sure. I'm just totally imagining this. And what I've heard is that he got a little bit of money and a little bit of help mixing. And what they did was they transferred that mix to an 8-track recorder. So I think what they did was they took those 4 tracks and put those onto 2 tracks in stereo. In other words, they mixed down all 4 of those things and put them on 2 tracks. Basically, you're locked in now. However you mix those 4 tracks down into 2 tracks, you're locked in. So now you only have this many tracks left to record whatever else you want to put in there. And your vocals, your lead vocal. If you want to double your lead vocal, then you have your background vocals. You want just 2 or 4, and then maybe another lead guitar, maybe another instrument. Anyway, that's how they used to record back in those days. Now you have digital audio workstations that people use, where you have, I think, 1 billion tracks that you can record, however many tracks your computer's memory can handle. And I think that part of the appeal to me in a lot of these older albums that were recorded by one person, and especially one person who is not the Beatles and didn't have access to literally everything in the world, somebody like Emitt Rhodes, and in the early days of Todd Rundgren and people like that, where they spent a lot of time working on the recording. And I think Emitt Rhodes. There's some videos of him on YouTube. There's a documentary someone made where they went to visit him at home, and it's a bit sad, but also a little bit uplifting to see him getting some love from people. But it's a little bit sad that he didn't go further. He didn't stay in the recording world longer. He didn't record more, and there's not a whole lot of performance of videos. I think with Emitt Rhodes, he was one of those guys that he was more into the songwriting and the playing, the construction of songs, like building a song and creating these great pop songs, these great pop. I mean, just about every song on here honestly sounds like a hit. You can imagine listening to this and thinking, okay, in 1970, 1971, around that time, that should have been a hit, should have been all over the radio. And there's more than one on there. It's not just one hit sounding song with a bunch of filler. It's like every song on there is carefully constructed, beautifully recorded, beautifully built pop song with great vocals, like really distinctively Emitt Rhodes' voice. Anyway, I could go on and on, but that's one record I'm going to do. I'm going to try to make these things, kind of parse them out a little bit. I'm going to talk about people who do more than one record. I'm going to, if there's a bunch that I can put together in a reasonable way, a rational way. But every so often, I'm just going to talk about one record because this one deserves its own episode. This is a classic. A classic. Everybody needs to get this record, and it's like that picture. It's like a house that burned down or something, and it's just got a little bit melancholy in a way, which kind of represents how I feel his life was in a way, which is kind of sad. He was such a great songwriter, but unfortunately just got so much. Every time you read some press, contemporary press at the time the record came out, it compared him to Paul McCartney every time. Beatles, and it was Beatles, Paul McCartney, and I can only imagine that he was probably thinking, I'm flattered, which he did say he was flattered by that, but after a while you're like, can't you hear me in there? Can't you hear me in my songs? I don't know. He must have felt a little bit overshadowed, of course, by the Beatles and Paul McCartney, but also a little bit betrayed by the sort of pop people who accepted bands like the Kinks and other bands that were just doing their own thing and not being, overly compared to other people, and the implication always being that he was copying or trying to be the next Beatles or whatever. I think he's very distinct. I think he has his own distinct sound, and I really advocate Emitt Rhodes. I think you should go find this record, dig up some stuff on YouTube. Listen to him first. Listen to him and kind of get into him before you watch that recent documentary. It's hey dog. It's a documentary that was made, a few years before he passed away, and it's a visit to his house and sort of a look into his world. And the people that made the documentary obviously huge fans, and they talk to him, and he seems a little melancholy. He seems, in his later years, to be sort of like that melancholy guy looking out the window there, sort of always separated from the world of fame and fortune and concerts and all that kind of stuff. But then again, maybe he didn't want that stuff. Anyway, Emitt Rhodes, track him down, find him, listen to this album, and tell me in the comments if you already knew about Emitt Rhodes, if you discovered Emitt Rhodes recently, or if I told you about him, you never heard of him before, and you listened to it and you really, you're like, wow, thanks for telling me about somebody I never heard of. That would be nice to hear, but I have a feeling if you watch this podcast, you're way ahead of me. You've known about Emitt Rhodes for years. But anyway, thanks for watching, and thanks for commenting and everything. Everybody leaves such nice comments. I'm always thrilled. Every once in a while, they'll call me out on something I said that wasn't quite accurate, and I'm like, well, yeah, that's good too. But I like the nice comments. So keep them coming, everybody. And thanks for watching, and I will talk to you again real soon.